One of Carl Jung's most profound achievements was his concept of the shadow. And as conscious beings, Jung felt it necessary to face our shadow in order to become whole. But what happens when we confront the darkest corners of the human psyche? Nosferatu is a story of just that, a confrontation of the shadow. If you aren't familiar with the concept of the shadow, here's a brief overview according to Jung. The shadow refers to the unconscious parts of our psyche that we repress or ignore because of its inconsistency with our self-image or societal expectations. Now, the name might infer negativity or quote-unquote bad, but it simply isn't the case. The shadow contains aspects of ourselves that we are either consciously aware of or unwilling to see. These aspects can be traits, desires, or impulses that we deem unacceptable. So how do we connect Count Orlok with the concept of the shadow? Orlok is a classic archetypal embodiment of the shadow within Jungian psychology. Orlok represents the primal, repressed, and destructive aspects of the psyche that we ignore or deny. What reaction do you have when you see Orlok's appearance? With his emaciated frame and rat-like features, it's hard to not feel a sense of unease. He is an embodiment of everything we find repulsive or unacceptable in ourselves. His association with decay and disease reminds us of our fear of mortality, a universal human anxiety often repressed into the unconscious. The non-human demeanor, from his elongated fingers to the inhumane movements, are a projection of our fears for what lies beyond the known. Orlok is a representation of our primal instincts. A core feature of his character is his unrestrained appetite for blood. This is obvious. This need is a symbolization of uncontrollable greed. But his feeding of blood is comparable to the fear of being consumed by our own base desires. Remember, our conscious, rational mind is there to suppress the uninhibited desires. Obviously, to become a whole person requires balance and not succumbing to our every want and pleasure. Orlok does not create, he only consumes. When we look inward at our own shadow, what are those fears and desires that drain us emotionally and spiritually? Orlok is our shadow left unchecked, sapping our psychic energy without our knowing. He is also a projection of our societal fears in various ways. For one, his arrival into town only brings about panic and fear. Why? Because he brings death in the form of the plague. It's a connection to epidemics like the Black Death and the Spanish flu. Secondly, his foreignness, a Transylvanian noble, reflects our cultural anxieties about invasion from external forces. His thirst for blood, the draining of resources, could be seen as the historical fear of industrialization and those economic systems often perceived as soulless, greedy, and all-consuming of human vitality. What does Orlok's existence in the dark tell us about the unconscious? His existence in the shadows and his aversion to sunlight explain Jung's concept of the shadow living in the unconscious. Orlok, or the shadow, thrive in the unseen mind, away from consciousness. His ultimate demise comes at the hands of light, a representation of awareness and truth. The way his shadow runs along the walls and casts over the town, a representation of how the shadow influences the psychic indirectly, casting itself over our actions, emotions, and perceptions without conscious awareness. The shadow can unconsciously consume an individual, draining the psychic energy and resulting in unwanted fears or compulsive behaviors, just as Orlok feeds on victims and wreaks havoc throughout town. Orlok serves as a mirror, reflecting back to us, the viewer, our own fears and anxieties. It's not only that we fear his presence, but we fear what he elicits from within our own shadow. His existence forces us to confront the uncomfortable truths of our own psyche. But only through this confrontation can we elicit growth and make strides towards individuation. Nosferatu is also a demonstration of various archetypes throughout the use of main characters, one of which being Thomas, Ellen's husband. Thomas serves as the ego within Jungian psychology. The ego is the conscious self, whose main priorities are to maintain order and navigate external reality. But his inability to handle Orlok is a symbolic depiction of the ego's struggle to confront and integrate the shadow, leaving the unconscious forces at bay to destroy the ego. One of the ego's main flaws is its focus on external realities, or in the case of Thomas, money and success, rather than a focus on inner growth. His naivety to journey to Orlok's castle demonstrates his unpreparedness to confront the darkness within the unconscious. Various times throughout his travel, he was warned about the dangers. These warnings, from the locals telling him to not venture to Orlok, or the eerie landscape surrounding the castle, were symbols of the unconscious, and just how out of touch he was with his inner psyche. Once Thomas finally makes contact with Orlok, we see the ego's first attempt at confronting the shadow. Obviously, it goes horribly wrong, for Thomas dismisses Orlok's sinister nature, choosing to ignore the obvious signs of danger. It's simply the ego's resistance to acknowledging the shadow. By the time Thomas realizes the danger he faces, it's too late. The repressed shadow has overtaken the unprepared ego mind. And while Thomas escapes the grasps of Orlok and his castle and returns to his wife Ellen, there was no psychological growth achieved. His physical escape does not equate to confronting and integrating the shadow, but rather an ego failure to take responsibility for its own unconscious forces. While we can admire Thomas's call for adventure, representing the ego's first attempt towards the unconscious, his journey is ultimately a fragmented hero's journey. He fails to integrate the wisdom of his encounter with Orlok. He remains a static being, leaving others to fix his failures, or in this case his wife, Ellen. His journey is a cautionary tale of what happens when the ego denies its own unconscious depths. It's a reminder for us to take personal responsibility for our own psychological growth and well-being, to face our shadow with courage. His story highlights the importance of actively engaging with our shadow, so we can achieve greater balance and individuation. But there is a way out. Ellen, the female protagonist, represents what is known in Jungian psychology as the anima. The anima is a portrayal of the feminine aspects of the unconscious in men. Ellen, in this sense, acts as a mediator or guide towards the deeper self and the process of individuation. It's evident throughout the film that Ellen sees, hears, and understands what others cannot. Hence her connection with Orlok. Just as Orlok is the embodiment of the unconscious, her husband Thomas, with his rationality and naive optimism, is the depiction of the conscious mind. So as she is the bridge between the two, her significance lies in her ability to confront the shadow consciously. Ellen's attempts to convince others of Orlok's presence speaks to her understanding of the shadow, and ultimately how she must offer herself to Orlok to destroy the shadow externally, thus integrating its destructive power and transforming it into growth and renewal for the town or collective. It's a self-sacrifice that requires courage in the face of fear, but knowing full well that it will be for the greater good. Her actions ensure that the shadow will not consume this collective psyche of the town. She is more than a character. She is a symbolic guide for us all, as we strive to achieve individuation. Her courage, empathy, and willingness to confront the shadow is a reminder of the path we all must embark on, transforming our own fears into strengths and chaos into balance.